It's strange how something as small as a swipe can change the entire direction of a life. One moment, a person is sitting at home scrolling through profiles, thinking about nothing more than conversation, connection, or curiosity. And in the next, they're stepping into a situation they never could have predicted. That's the unsettling part about modern dating. Everything feels normal until the moment it isn't. This story begins exactly like that. A message, a match, and a meeting that looked harmless, but slowly unraveled into one of Britain's most alarming cases, reminding everyone that behind the brightest smile on an app can sometimes be a shadow no one expects. The connection between them started with a kind of simplicity that defines most online conversations. A shared interest, a joke that landed correctly, a few pictures that created the impression of someone confident, friendly, and easy to talk to. For the victim, it didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like the natural progression of meeting someone in the digital age. There was no reason to be suspicious, no warning signs loud enough to raise concern, and no indication that anything was out of place. Like so many people using dating apps across the UK, they believed that meaningful, positive interactions were far more common than negative ones, and in almost every case, that's true. But this encounter slowly began developing small inconsistencies that only made sense in hindsight. Messages that sounded a bit too eager, stories that didn't fully line up, future plans mentioned too quickly. Yet none of these things seemed threatening at the time, just quirks, maybe nerves, maybe excitement. That's how deception often works. Quiet, subtle, blending into normal life until it becomes too late to notice the shift. When they finally agreed to meet in person, everything appeared as expected. A public space, a casual atmosphere, a simple plan that didn't raise any alarms. Dating culture had become so normalized that meeting someone from an app didn't feel dangerous, it felt routine. And that comfort became the very thing that hid the danger. During the early parts of the meetup, everything seemed fine on the surface. Casual conversation, introductions, small talk. But gradually, a change began to show itself. The energy wasn't quite the same as in the messages. The person behind the screen had small details to them that didn't match their digital personality. They seemed distracted at moments, overly intense at others, and occasionally vague when talking about themselves. These weren't things that signaled immediate danger, but they were the kind of inconsistencies that make a person feel quietly unsettled. The victim did notice some of these things, but not in a way that would make them think something extreme was coming. After all, awkward dates are common. People behave differently in person, and sometimes social discomfort doesn't mean anything more than a mismatch. It was only later that investigators realized these early moments were the first cracks in a carefully constructed image. Small signals that the version of the person shown online was not the version standing in front of them. As the evening progressed, more details came to light that felt somewhat unusual but never overtly threatening. The date talked about certain experiences vaguely, avoided direct questions, and occasionally shifted the conversation in a way that made the victim unsure how to respond. Still, nothing happened that crossed the clear line, and like many people in uncomfortable social moments, the victim tried to stay polite and composed. In modern dating culture, people often tolerate awkwardness to avoid offending someone, especially when they're trying to give the benefit of the doubt. But what they didn't know was that the situation they were in wasn't just awkward, it was unpredictable, influenced by underlying intentions the victim had no way of seeing. By the time the evening reached its later stages, the dynamic had shifted again. There was a quiet tension, subtle, muted, but present. The victim felt it, but without context, there was no reason to interpret it as danger. Humans naturally try to rationalize discomfort. Maybe the date was nervous, maybe they were socially clumsy, maybe they were just not as confident as their profile suggested. The mind looks for the simplest explanation, not the darkest one. But the truth of who this person was would only come out long after everything had unfolded. In the days that followed, investigators would discover patterns in their previous behavior, discrepancies in their personal history, and worrying signs that their online persona was carefully curated to hide certain traits. Friends and acquaintances later described them as someone who could switch between charm and detachment with surprising ease, someone who knew how to present themselves in a way that made others lower their guard. And that was the heart of the danger. Not something dramatic or obvious, but something subtle, practiced, and nearly invisible until it was too late to turn back. This case ultimately became known not just for what happened that night, but for what it exposed about digital trust. It forced people to reflect on how easy it is to let someone into your life when their intentions are hidden behind carefully selected photos and polished messages. It showed how digital interactions can create a false sense of closeness, making people feel connected to someone they've never actually met. And it highlighted the reality that, even in a world filled with safety advice, new technology makes it harder than ever to truly understand who someone is before standing in front of them. The victim in this story had no reason to expect danger. They did what millions of people do every day: meet someone new, hoping for a good experience. But their trust was misplaced, and the person they thought they were meeting wasn't the one who showed up. In hindsight, the signs become clearer: the inconsistencies, the odd behavior, the shifting tone. But in the moment, everything blended into the normal uncertainties of early dating. There was no reason to anticipate the tragic turn that would eventually make this one of Britain's most unsettling online dating cases.
As the investigation unfolded further, what truly captured the attention of the detectives was the small yet meaningful inconsistencies that began appearing in the digital records tied to that evening. Although the meeting itself had seemed friendly and ordinary, the hours that followed painted a picture that was far more complicated than anyone initially imagined. Investigators learned that the man who had matched with her online had created multiple profiles over a span of months, each with slightly different details, slightly altered photos, and carefully adjusted descriptions that made it difficult for casual observers to notice anything unusual. But once the authorities started examining everything in sequence, the pattern began to emerge, revealing a trail that had been carefully designed to appear harmless, yet carried a level of intentional planning that immediately raised concern. The detectives understood that a person who put that much effort into creating a digital persona was someone who clearly wanted to manage impressions, control how they appeared, and avoid leaving behind any clear footprint that could be traced back easily. This realization pushed the investigation in a direction no one had expected earlier, urging them to consider whether the suspect had engaged in similar behavior before or whether this was part of a larger pattern of misleading interactions that had previously gone unnoticed. What complicated matters even more was the discovery that several of the conversations he had online displayed a tone that shifted dramatically depending on who he was speaking to, suggesting he adjusted his personality to match the needs, interests, or vulnerabilities of whoever he engaged with. Detectives recognized this as a psychological red flag, an indicator often associated with individuals who were skilled at presenting themselves as charming, considerate, or trustworthy, while concealing motives that were unclear or intentionally ambiguous. And although the investigators were careful not to jump to conclusions, they understood that such behavior could not be dismissed as coincidence. Every detail needed to be checked, every conversation traced, and every digital step pieced together so the full picture could be understood without leaving room for speculation. In interviews with friends and acquaintances, the detectives learned even more about the way she approached meeting people. She was cautious, thoughtful, and not someone who took unnecessary risks. This only deepened the mystery surrounding why she had felt comfortable enough to meet with someone she barely knew. That contrast prompted investigators to look closer at the man's communication style in the days leading up to the meeting. And as they read through the messages, they began noticing subtle techniques, phrases designed to create trust, reassuring language, and seemingly harmless comments that, when laid out chronologically, showed a gradual yet deliberate effort to establish a sense of familiarity quickly. It wasn't aggressive, nor was it overt. Instead, it was gentle, paced, and crafted to feel natural. But when compared against other conversations he had, the same method repeated itself, proving that this was not random behavior, but something he had practiced repeatedly. Meanwhile, the detectives were also analyzing the location data stored on devices, an essential tool that helped them reconstruct the timeline with remarkable accuracy. Each timestamp, each movement from one area to another, each pause, each period of inactivity, everything was examined, and the more they reviewed the data, the more troubling the gaps became. There were segments of time where the suspect's device appeared to have been intentionally disabled or placed in airplane mode, breaking the continuity of his digital trail. This was highly unusual for someone who claimed he had nothing to hide. Investigators knew that most people do not turn off their location services at random, especially during social outings. Such omissions often indicate an effort to conceal movements or create confusion later. This discovery became one of the most significant breakthroughs in the case, as it provided a crucial anchor point for the detectives to start questioning every detail of the suspect's account. They approached him again for questioning, this time with more precise inquiries, and although he attempted to maintain his earlier version of events, his responses became noticeably less confident. Detectives were trained to observe even the smallest changes in body language, longer pauses, shifting posture, altered tone, and they noticed all of them. What made the interrogation even more telling was that when confronted with the inconsistencies in his digital trail, he struggled to offer explanations that made sense. His answers contradicted previous statements, and when investigators gently pressed him for clarity, he attempted to redirect the conversation multiple times, something they took careful note of. These behavioral shifts were not enough to accuse him, but they added to the growing list of reasons why the case required deeper scrutiny. Simultaneously, investigators reached out to experts who specialized in online behavior and digital communication patterns. These specialists offered insights into how individuals construct false personas, how they manipulate conversations to create emotional connections quickly, and how they choose certain phrasing to lower defenses. The expert analysis aligned so closely with what investigators had already found that it strengthened their confidence in the direction they were heading. It also helped them better interpret the suspect's communication style, making it easier to understand his intentions even if he never stated them explicitly. While all of this was unfolding, the detectives continued to examine footage from various CCTV cameras positioned around the areas the two had visited that evening. Although privacy laws required careful handling of the footage, the information it provided became invaluable. The videos revealed subtle details, walking patterns, timing discrepancies, and physical proximity that contradicted the narrative he initially provided. And while none of the footage showed anything inappropriate, the inconsistencies between his actions and his statements raised further questions about what truly happened after he left her. Every new piece of evidence pushed the investigation forward not through dramatic revelations, but through steady, methodical work that built a foundation of facts strong enough to support the truth. Detectives were determined to uncover what had really happened, not based on assumptions or speculation, but on verified digital records, behavioral analysis, and careful examination of his shifting narrative. And as the case progressed, it became clearer that the truth would not lie in grand moments, but in these carefully pieced together fragments, the silent clues left behind by devices, messages, footprints, and the inconsistencies that people often overlook when crafting a story they hope others will believe.
And with the investigation now relying on these fragments of truth, the detectives understood that the final stage of the case required even more patience, clarity, and precision, because the story they were uncovering was not simply about one meeting gone wrong, but about a chain of choices, behaviors, and hidden intentions that had existed long before the two ever crossed paths. As they moved deeper into the digital and psychological layers of the case, they discovered that the suspect's attempts to shape his online identity were only part of a larger effort to shape how others perceived him in real life as well. This became especially clear when investigators examined how he interacted with people in his daily routine. Several acquaintances described him as someone who seemed confident on the surface, yet often tried too hard to project an image of control, charm, and emotional steadiness. These personality traits were subtle, but when combined with everything else unfolding in the investigation, they suggested that he was someone who paid close attention to how he appeared in every interaction. That realization led detectives to revisit earlier interviews and cross-reference every detail with the digital evidence they had gathered, because they now recognized that the truth wouldn't come from a single revelation, but from observing where his self-constructed image cracked under pressure. As they continued analyzing those cracks, they noticed that his social media activity carried an almost rehearsed tone, posts carefully curated to make him look responsible, friendly, and reliable. There was nothing outwardly alarming, but detectives could see how each post seemed designed to support a narrative that made questioning his motives more difficult. They reached out to digital behavior analysts once again, who pointed out that individuals who meticulously craft online personalities often rely on those personas as shields. This meant that the suspect might have assumed that his online image would protect him from suspicion, especially in a case where first impressions had initially painted him as an everyday, trustworthy individual. It was a strategy that may have worked with others before, but investigators were now looking beneath that surface with a level of scrutiny he never anticipated. At the same time, the detectives were still trying to piece together her final movements with absolute certainty, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that every step she took that night was traced with accuracy and compassion. Interviews with her friends revealed important emotional context: how excited she had been earlier in the evening, how she had double-checked the details of the meeting, and how she had expressed a desire to stay safe at all times. These insights mattered deeply because they allowed investigators to understand her mindset, her instincts, and her character at the time. They wanted to honor her by ensuring that the narrative around the case reflected who she truly was: careful, responsible, thoughtful, and hopeful. This emotional grounding kept the investigation human, reminding everyone involved that the timeline was not just data, it was the story of a real person who had trusted someone she believed was genuine. With this understanding, the detectives revisited the suspect's inconsistencies once more, comparing his statements against the verified timeline. Each contradiction became harder for him to explain, and the investigation team began to see a clearer pattern. Every time he felt cornered by evidence, his explanations shifted slightly, as though he were trying to find a version of events that would satisfy the investigators without exposing the truth he was hiding. But the detectives were trained to notice these shifts, and each adjustment in his story became another thread they could follow. They recognized that people who fabricate narratives often struggle to maintain consistency when confronted with precise timelines, especially when digital records contradict them. And the investigation had plenty of digital records: location pings, message timestamps, app activity logs, and security footage, all forming a stable structure that his words could no longer fit into. Even with all this, the detectives maintained careful professionalism, ensuring that every step they took respected both the sensitivity of the case and the standards required for a fair investigation. They continued to build the timeline piece by piece, strengthening it with expert analysis, factual evidence, and cross-checked information. They also kept in close contact with her family, providing honest updates and letting them know that the case was progressing steadily. It was important for the family to feel seen and heard, especially during such a painful time, and the detectives made sure to reassure them that every effort was being made to uncover what truly happened without rushing or making assumptions. The family's strength throughout this period became a quiet source of motivation for the investigative team, reminding them why their work mattered so deeply. Meanwhile, the suspect's online activity from months earlier was also being examined. Investigators discovered he had a habit of deleting conversations shortly after they ended, a practice that raised further suspicion because it suggested a desire to avoid leaving behind records. When questioned about this behavior, he dismissed it as a preference for privacy,
but detectives noted that this explanation didn't align with the frequency of his deletions or the selective nature of the conversations he chose to remove. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that he had spent considerable time controlling what parts of his digital footprint remained visible and which parts quietly disappeared. This discovery reinforced what behavioral experts had already suggested. He was someone who wanted to be seen in a very specific way, and anything that didn't support that image was eliminated. Investigators also began speaking with individuals who had interacted with him on dating apps, and while most of these interactions were brief and uneventful, several people mentioned feeling that something about him seemed too polished or too smooth, as though he were performing rather than being himself. These comments weren't accusations, they were simply observations, but they helped detectives understand the pattern of behavior more clearly. He was skilled at adapting quickly, presenting himself in ways that made people feel comfortable before they had time to question anything deeper. And while such behavior isn't inherently criminal, in the context of this investigation, it became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Throughout this careful reconstruction of events, detectives maintained their focus on ensuring accuracy. They knew that the truth had to be grounded not only in digital evidence, but also in human understanding. Why people behave the way they do, how trust is formed, how impressions are shaped, and how subtle shifts in behavior can reveal intention. And as they connected all the threads, the case gradually transformed from a confusing set of contradictions into a coherent narrative of what truly unfolded. It wasn't about dramatic twists or sudden revelations, it was about persistence, clarity, and the refusal to overlook even the smallest detail. By the time investigators reached the final stages of the timeline, they had uncovered nearly every layer of deception that had initially hidden the truth. What they were left with was a deep understanding of how the encounter had evolved, how trust had been built under false pretenses, how intentions had been misrepresented, and how the digital age, despite its conveniences, often masks unseen risks. This understanding allowed them to move forward with confidence, not only in presenting the facts, but also in ensuring that her story would be told with accuracy, dignity, and the respect she deserved.